Welcome to the second episode of the Nostalgic Pixel. This episode, we're going to be looking at beat-em-ups on console from the golden age of beat-em-ups. These games, I think, really helped shape the genre. I remember playing most of these games in the arcade, and I was excited to be able to bring them home and play them with my friends. Most of these games can be beat with a friend over a weekend or in one shot. Let's take a look. First up is Double Dragon on the NES, released in 1988 by Technos. Some consider this game to be the first in the genre. It may have seemed that way to me growing up, but it is not. However, Double Dragon has reached success that no other game in its genre had experienced thus far. The game started the golden age of beat-em-ups. I really enjoyed playing this in the arcade lock-ins with my friends. Like most games of this genre, this is an arcade port. There were many quality arcade ports on the original black box NES titles. The arcades, however, were always constantly working to stay ahead of the console market, so at this point in time, the port had to be completely redesigned around the console. Sadly, this version lacks co-op. For me, this was a big part of the fun, for me playing with a friend working together to beat the game. When at home, alone, in my room, this was a good time to play. Going over to a friend's house was, we'd take turns, and that got old fast. The premise of Double Dragon is really straightforward. The Shadow Warriors kidnapped your girlfriend, and you and your friend have to go rescue her. The NES version does have more limits compared to the arcade version. You can only have 2 opponents on screen, whereas in the arcade version you could have up to 4. So with this in mind, just watch your back and try to keep them on opposite sides or corral them together. On the NES port though, it does offer also a versus mode where you can go head to head against your opponent or your friend. One thing I didn't care for was because this was a console, not an arcade, they set limits on your lives and continues. In the arcade version, you just insert a coin. This was likely in an effort to make the game more lasting challenge and to curb the rental market. Let's take a quick look at another 8-bit console port on the Sega Master System. This is a better looking and co-op version, which is a bunch of fun and a must-have. It's a feather in the cap for the Master System owner at the time. This is a very fun version. I still think the NES soundtrack has the edge over this version. Next up is Golden Axe on the Genesis, released in 1991 by Sega. Not all have to be urban brawlers. This arcade port was a showcase for what the Genesis does. While not a perfect arcade port, it was the beginning of a more faithful ports. Sega had many great games in the arcades at this time, and Sega was cranking out ports out on the Genesis. The story is that there's an evil dictator, the Death Adder, and he has murdered your friend Alex. So you set off for revenge. There are 3 players to choose from. There's the axe-wielding dwarf, Gilius. His brother was killed by Death Adder's soldiers. There was a broadsword-wielding barbarian, Axe, looking to revenge his mother's murder. Lastly, there's a longsword-wielding Amazon, Tyrus. They are similar, but each have different weapons and special attacks. This was a nice complication to the game. I'm great at pushing the wrong button and burning my special early on accident. Usually this happens just once. Each character has different special magic abilities that you can collect magic jars to build up to even bigger magic attacks. Tyrus can unleash the strongest of the magical attacks. This game also has unique monsters that you can ride as a mount. This is fun, but sometimes you get caught in a loop with the enemy where you're both trading places on the mount until the mount wants nothing to do with either of you and leaves. This game had a sequel that was exclusive to the arcade, but there were also console sequels made. A third one was released only in Japan on the Sega Mega Drive. Next, we move on to Final Fight on the Super Nintendo, released in 1991 by Capcom. Right out of the gate, the Super Nintendo received a port of Capcom's arcade hit Final Fight. Graphically, at first glance, this looks to be very faithful. Like Double Dragon on the NES, though, this game is as fun as long as you like taking turns or playing alone, as this is a single-player game. Although this genre for me is always more fun co-op. The game has 2 selectable characters in this version, Cody, the boyfriend, and Hager, the mayor. Guy was the 3rd character in the arcade and was left out of this version. Capcom later released a Guy version, but they swapped out Cody for Guy instead of 3 choices. Also, this version was censored on the Super Nintendo version. Most notable change was to the 2 enemies, Poison and Roxy, who were replaced by Sid and Billy. I played this many times in the arcade, and this was one of the first games that I got for my Super Nintendo. The story is, the Mad Gear Gang kidnapped Cody's girlfriend, who is also the daughter of the mayor, Hager. They picked the wrong mayor. While no sequels in the arcade, there were 2 more on the Super Nintendo. I didn't think much of these at first. My experience was from the arcade. At this time, I was more interested in playing Street Fighter II. Again, this arcade port lays out restrictions on lives and continues, where in the arcade, you just inserted a coin. Later, Final Fight CD, released for the Sega CD in 1993 by Capcom. While this was a late port, it was impressive to see on the Sega CD. Even with the limited colors on screen, this port handled it very well. Also, there are 3 characters to choose from, and it is co-op. The Sega CD version kept Poison and Roxy in. Although censored in the US still, they now have longer shirts and shorts. While no Final Fight 2 was released in the arcades, this game shares ties to the Street Fighter games, and that it was almost the sequel to the original Street Fighter. Many of the characters made their way onto other Street Fighter games. Up next is Streets of Rage 2 on the Genesis, released in 1992 by Sega. This quick sequel, a year after its original, was another shot at it, and boy did they get it right. This game, unlike others, was designed for the Genesis and also had an arcade release. The first one was Sega's answer to Final Fight, and the sequel was just to keep the energy rolling. Growing up, I had both the Genesis, Super Nintendo, and Sega CD. I saw these games at first as a cheap knockoff. It has a kind of Me Too attitude. Even though I had both consoles, I didn't and couldn't buy all the games. I spent more time playing this at friends' houses. However, going back and playing these over the years, Streets of Rage 2 just holds up very well. This has become one of my favorites of the genre. You have to remember that Sega is not new to this genre when they came out with this one. Great music composed by Yuzo Koshiro. Some other works he has done is ActRaiser, Revenge of Shinobi, and Shenmue. Next up, we've got Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 4: Turtles in Time, released on Super Nintendo in 1992 by Konami. Another great arcade port. This has 2-player, when the arcade had 4-player. I also remember playing these games at the arcade. While this is the 4th Turtles game on the Nintendo console, it is actually just the sequel to the arcade. This game is a great example of what was going on in the genre at the time. Licensed arcade games, this time, were being made as beat-em-ups. Others were The Simpsons and X-Men, released by Konami, Michael Jackson Moonwalker, released by Sega, Alien vs. Predator, and Dungeons & Dragons, released by Capcom. At the time, I was thrilled to play this at home, as the first Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 2 arcade on the NES left a lot to be desired from the arcade port. In this version, you can play 2-player and choose between all 4 turtles. The arcade had a 4-player cabinet. The story goes as you travel through time to defeat Shredder. Also, I want to mention Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Hyperstone Heist on the Sega Genesis, released in 1992 by Konami. This unique release is not a straight port of one arcade, but rather a mix-up of the two into a new game, sort of. This was Sega's answer to Teenage Mutant Turtles, Turtles in Time on the Super Nintendo. I also really enjoy this game and appreciate its efforts as a solid beat-em-up. I wanted to mention this game because it is another one of Sega saying, "Me too." It is a fun mashup, a good cut and paste job. Well, there you have it. That's a look at some beat-em-ups on console from the golden age of beat-em-ups. There are so many great beat-em-ups, many left in arcades. I hope you've enjoyed this look into the genre, as it is one of my favorite genres growing up. Also, guys, on a program note, I'm looking at making some changes in my future videos, perhaps cover fewer games, even have episodes centric to one game. Thanks again for watching. Please like and subscribe, share with your friends. Please, if you have any beat-em-ups that you'd like to play, feel free to leave them in the comment below, as well as perhaps any other games you would like me to cover in the future. Thanks again for watching Nostalgic Pixel.